and welcome to the first episode of Penmanship, a podcast about Australian writing culture. I'm your host, Andrew McMillen. I'm a freelance journalist and author based in Brisbane, Australia. I've started this podcast for a rather selfish reason. I wanted to sit down and pick the brains of people who earn a living through working with words, writers, editors and publishers, among others, to discuss their careers and their craft at length. My first guest is Trent Dalton, staff writer at the Weekend Australian magazine. I have admired Trent's work for many years, since he was a staff writer for Q Weekends, the colour magazine and the Courier Mail newspaper each Saturday. My own history with Trent dates back to April 2009, when I was making my first tentative steps into pursuing freelance journalism. After reading one of Trent's brilliantly written feature stories, I sent a short, sharp email to the editor of that magazine at the time. I wrote, "Hi Q Weekend, love your work. I'm a young writer. I'd appreciate it if you could put me in contact with Trent Dalton. Thanks, Andrew." That's it. Nearly 4 weeks later, to my surprise and gratitude, Trent Dalton got back to me directly. He wrote, "Hi Andrew, I understand you were trying to get in touch. Sorry I haven't been back to you sooner. It's been a madhouse here. Hope you're riding up a storm, mate. Talk anytime, Trent." And I should note that he included 2 exclamation marks after mate. That response is so typical of Trent Dalton. Kind, caring, encouraging, and overwhelmingly positive. At that point, he did not know me from a sack of shit. He didn't know whether I was serious about writing or just someone trying the idea on for size to see if it would fit me. It would have been extremely easy for Trent to ignore or dismiss my email, but he didn't. He replied, and from that short exchange began a friendship and a kind of loose mentorship that continues to this day. Trent Dalton is one of the most influential journalists in my life. His writing moves and inspires me with shocking regularity. Judging by the volume of praise-filled letters to the editor published in the Weekend Australian magazine following each of his stories, I'm not the only one who feels this way. I've interviewed Trent a couple of times before, in 2010 and 2011, about a handful of his award-winning stories. The transcripts of those conversations were published on my website, andrewmcmillen.com, and I'll include the links to those transcripts in the show notes. Now, though, I'm honoured to share my most recent interview with Trent here, in the very first episode of Penmanship. Our conversation took place at the News Corporation building in Bowen Hills, Brisbane, in January 2015. Trent led me to a cavernous, disused space toward the back of the building, which was rather depressingly dark and vacant. You'd struggle to find a more symbolic representation for the decline in newspaper publishing revenue than this scene. After we found an empty side office and shut the door, however, all dark thoughts vanished as Trent began telling me about his fascinating path to becoming one of the most renowned and awarded feature journalists in this country. He's been an inspiration to me and many others, and I'm honoured to introduce you to Trent Dalton, staff writer at the Weekend Australian magazine. Welcome, Trent Dalton. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Andrew. I'm truly honoured to be part of your first podcast.
So the purpose of this show, I'm not sure if I've told you this until now, is to explore the careers and crafts and inner lives of people who have made a living from writing words in Australia. And I'm honoured to have you here because you are one of the finest journalists in the country, I believe.
That's very, very kind of you, and probably a little generous. But yeah, I'm very flattered to be here. It's great.
To begin, so we're going to go through kind of your whole career, but I thought I'd ask something kind of meta to start with.
Meta? I love meta.
This is a show for journalists and for people interested in journalism.
Yeah.
I want to know about your interviewing technique. So if you'd never met me before and I was a potential interviewee for a story, how would you go about approaching me? What would be your first words to me?
Oh wow, interesting question. That's a great first question right there. But it's funny. I always talk to my wife about this because I met my wife Fiona at the first place I worked, which is Brisbane News, and she used to hear me do these interviews, and I used to have the same kind of start question, which was one of two things. The first one was, as far as years go, how's 2003 going for you. And then the other one was what was the other one? I would say was something like just a kind of just any kind of ice-breaking kind of question where I'd go, where are you right now? Always talking about, I'm always interested in context. So you'd say, something like, first of all, how's, where are you? How's things? That kind of thing. But even just meeting the person, funnily enough, like I just did a story with Lincoln Lewis and Wally Lewis, the the father-son, brilliant, Lewis family, and and there's this great line that Lincoln said to me. I'm just like intensely grateful that someone's just turned up, right? Like, because and it just this cuts back to like that early days of your own sort of journalism, where you're just happy to talk to anyone, that someone is actually talking to you. And so I'm always probably a bit over the top in my my kind of gratitude that they've turned up. So I'll try and let them know that pretty quick, and then I don't know. I think that sometimes serves to, if I can bring a kind of enthusiasm, then maybe they might bring some enthusiasm too. So for example, with Lincoln Lewis, this beautiful young actor who is Wally Lewis's kid, and but he's so enthusiastic, that guy, and he kind of matched my enthusiasm when I said something along the lines of, "Thanks for coming. I know how busy you are. Thanks for coming." He goes, "Mate, I'm an unemployed actor. You've dragged me away from a tall glass of Milo." And I just thought, what a cool response. And you get sort of, I don't know, that kind of honesty, pretty upfront from people like that. Then you can kind of take that all the way through an interview. But sometimes the first things I'll say are, I try not to be too, well, I'm guilty. I tell you what, I'm guilty of really letting my colours show early. For example, with Wally, like that man, that man like was huge in my world from about the age of 7 to 15, and particularly around 7 to about 10 when I was playing rugby league, and actually the only thing I wanted to do in my life was play rugby league for Queensland, and and so yet again I love this job so much because you get to go meet these people and have a reason to sit down and talk to them. But I couldn't control my kind of fandom of this man, and naturally sort of just rambled some nonsense about various tries that he scored and various tackles that he made against Kiwis, and but that also helps too, because I think it helps to show him that like he's sort of in safe hands, and it kind of it really sort of serves a decent chat sometimes. But but then other times you might have someone who doesn't want to talk to you, so then the same probably applies, but then you just have to keep it a bit more measured and keep it very formal, or if you're having some tale that you're about to tell that is really tragic, and then like I was interviewing Chantal Newbury, the beautiful Australian diver who sort of had a bunch of sort of troubles, and and that was just a total door knock situation, and I just went up to her house and knocked on her door, and given what she was going through, which was some drug related issues, and the last person she wants to see is a journo at her doorstep, and that's always a horrible thing to do, but you try and do that in the right way too, and just appeal to her I don't know, her maybe need to tell her story properly. So yeah, it's definitely something different for each person, and I definitely go on them, in terms of those first words, and and it's definitely a mood thing. You can really gauge very quickly whether someone's keen on doing your podcast or not, So I'm beaming here, I'm like really enjoying this. So because I love the podcast format, and I love your massive microphone here, and I'm learning a lot about how to do a podcast, so it's cool.
Thank you. All right, let's turn back the clock a bit. Where do you think your creativity came from, Trent?
Oh, wow. I've never thought about that. And my, I guess my, it's really interesting. My parents never ever showed any kind of sort of visible sort of signs of that they were into anything creative. My old man was sort of, the few jobs he had were factory based. My mum you know, she is a like works in a like an insurance, like Budget Direct. She works for Budget Direct on the phone lines, taking people's insurance claims. So it's sort of really interesting. But one thing, I guess, that both of those, you know, people who I love very much, they both read, you know, just, you know, read more than, you know, I probably, my father reads more than any human being I've ever met, and any human being I've ever seen. I would, he's like 63, and I believe he could challenge some people to like some sort of Guinness type stuff, at least in Queensland maybe, or some small towns. But he was just
a big library.
Well, he it's interesting. We would move to various houses, and he'd leave the books wherever we moved. He would just leave the books, these massive, but they're all just paperbacks and just things he'd picked up at St. Vinny's or you know, at, you know, sort of book exchanges. But one thing, you know, he always really encouraged anything vaguely creative. Myself and my 3 elder brothers, who were all very creative, and I have this one particular brother, Jesse, who's, you know, this beautiful creative guy, like a total creative soul, like, you know, singer-songwriter, you know, beautiful kind of, you know, he writes letters, handwritten letters to me to this day, you know, and they are some of the best writing I've ever seen in my life, you know, and he devastates me with his writing sometimes, that guy, and, you know, and so I guess creatively it was probably, actually, and I've just sort of found that answer as I'm sort of speaking it out loud, but it's definitely my brother Jesse, and he was, he used to paint things like on our, we shared a, you know, a room together growing up, and he used to like paint these poems like on his cupboard door and stuff, you know, and I just thought he was sort of slightly crazy. But now I look back and I go, no, he was just a true sort of creative soul, and you know, he really inspired me as a young man who was into like Wally Lewis, into football and rugby league, to maybe explore, you know, he was like a Kate Bush fan at 10 years old, and he was like running around. You got to picture Bracken Ridge Housing Commission area and a kid running up and down a Housing Commission street singing Wuthering Heights. You know, you've got to sort of picture that to really understand how creative his soul is. And and that was truly inspiring to me to sort of watch that. And so it's him. Yeah, it's definitely him. And with a lot of, you know, my other brothers as well, who were very creative. One guy was like a Cure fan and started a, you know, like a sort of goth rock band, and he's now in the army, you know, and we have all these sort of real, like, strange kind of, you know, conservative sides and sort of creative sides in my brothers and I, but that was always set free at any stage in our house. And our old man was sort of really cool in the sense of he really encouraged that, because he, you know, he was a fan of, you know, our great, you know, Earth's great creative minds like Bob Dylan and Lou Reed and, you know, Paul McCartney, you know, and he sort of saw that there was great merit in expressing yourself, and so that was always a wonderful gift he gave us. Yeah.
Which writers appealed to you early on?
I didn't read a lot early. Like my brothers read much more than me, but you know, Tolkien was probably, you know, the first kind of, that was like, you know, to be adult in our house, you had to sort of kind of read that. And you know, definitely early on, like in terms of like really formative, like inspiring books, it was John Steinbeck, anything John Steinbeck wrote, but you know, and then I probably started getting into, I went through this whole period of William Burroughs and a lot of these lot of books that were all about people, you know, getting wasted and kind of, you know, destroying themselves but sort of trying to find something else, but all the sort of classic things. But you know, I probably, and I'm just like a horrendously slow reader, so I didn't really read, you know, anywhere near, and I haven't yet read anywhere near enough books, you know, and but as far as that, definitely like John Steinbeck, and like, you know, Hemingway and you know, and I just went through all those books that sort of, I guess, I felt in my kind of, when in my teens that I had to read, you know, to sort of, because I'd read that I had to read them. But yeah, and then and it was really good because some, like Steinbeck, have just absolutely stayed with me and kind of genuinely shaped some of the things I started to believe, you know, and that was really special. So yeah, and it was like, yeah, like I just find it such a gift that those writers can bring. And then and then you start reading, like, you know, people like Dave Eggers and stuff, and you're just going, my God, you know, as you get a little bit older, and then, you know, you just think, wow, he's bringing something else to, you know, a more modern sort of view on things that really appeals to me. And so
when did magazine journalism enter the picture?
So magazine journalism, definitely. Okay, well, this is kind of embarrassing, but even when I was dead set 7 years old, I would go to, like, I was very familiar with the whole magazine concept at like 7, with magazines like Smash Hits and TV Hits. I don't know if any of these magazines ring a bell. And and I was like just this, I don't know, idiot kid who was into Johnny Depp. Like Johnny Depp, I really liked Johnny Depp, so I'd go get these. It sounds really stupid when I'm saying this, but I really liked Johnny Depp, and I'd go read like features on Johnny Depp in this TV Hits magazine, and they must have been so bad, these features, but I remember just going, wow. I'd find out all about Johnny Depp's life and how, like, he was in a, you know, a rock band, and he sort of switched and sort of landed a gig on, you know, 21 Jump Street, and did a bit part in Platoon and all this stuff. And, you know, I was right into films, and I remember the whole concept of, you know, this whole idea. I used to make collages out of these magazines and do my own little magazines and stick them up on my cupboard doors, like, about just the cool bits. So you'd have like a big sort of, you know, the Johnny Depp spread, and then it was stuff like that. And then I was right into sort of, you know, I got this weird obsession for Winona Ryder, and so I started, you know, reading about her, and then but then definitely, as far as magazines, you know, I started reading, you know, Cameron Crowe, who was sort of, you know, a bit of a godlike figure for me after I read his, you know, extraordinary sort of early day spread on Pearl Jam, and that was sort of, you know, so that's probably, you know, moving on towards early 90s now, but that was definitely, you know, this moment I remember distinctly. You know, the bottom bunk of a bed I shared with my brother in Bracken Ridge, and you're sitting there and you're reading a, you know, 6-page spread on the band that is single-handedly sort of changing your life and making you not become a dickhead. This band is what that band did, and you know, and so here I am reading this insight where Cameron Crowe gets to play basketball with Pearl Jam. So he's basically, the whole piece starts, he's playing basketball with Eddie Vedder and the bass player Jeff Ament, and I just thought, so Cameron Crowe's job was to go play basketball with Eddie Vedder and Jeff Ament, and the very nature of his job, like that moment, was getting inside the band. So it was good for him to be doing that. And like that was him doing his job well, that he was getting that access. And I just remember,
not just being an observant, but a participant.
Exactly. Well, exactly. That's right. And and he does become a participant in that piece. He goes on, you know, it's extraordinary, that piece, because, you know, he builds the trust in the band. Mind you, he was already sort of, you know, an established, known figure who was a filmmaker, and he'd done, you know, the movie Singles, in which Pearl Jam had done sort of cameos in the great, you know, fictional band Citizen Dick, with Matt Dillon as the lead singer, and you know, with the great Bridget Fonda, another iconic figure in my teens, and and so, but that story ends with him sitting, or it nears its end with him sitting on a gutter with Eddie Vedder, and Eddie's like sharing his soul about how Eddie was born, you know, to in a weird kind of situation, but basically, you know, he thought the father that he thought was his father wasn't his father, and that the lyrics to Alive are this weird, brilliant kind of incestual, crazy thing, in which, many things about Eddie's sort of character are revealed, and he's revealing it to Cameron Crowe, the whole story behind this song that, as much as John Steinbeck, that song and that band got me sort of, inspired about life as well. And, and so I just thought to myself, wow, like, that's a job, that is a serious, great job when you're young and you don't know anything about what you want to do. But that was definitely something along the lines of where I thought, wow, no, I could almost do something like that, where you could actually write and use something that the only thing I was ever good at was like English, and maybe sort of doing something like that. And I just and then it even goes back to like, English projects where I made a magazine and I'd build the ads and draw the ads and all that sort of stuff. It's a real love of magazines I've had for a long time in my life, and it was sort of massive, always has been a massive part of my life. Magazines, the whole concept, I love it. I just think that the visual nature of it, the design, and as you get it, and then now, like, I just watch this team, like, I write for the Weekend Australian magazine, and I get really excited when, like, the sub-editors do some amazing headline on my story, or my editor comes up with some amazing concept, some sort of conceptual thing. And, I just love that whole process. I really do. And it gives me a kick every time I see it. And I just think it's a really cool thing. And it's a really tangible piece of work that happens every week. It's a finished product and you put it out there to the public, and then, it might come full circle and they read it and pass it on. And, I just love every process of it, right down to, the idea of, the size of magazines and how they've changed over time, or the size of a newspaper insert and how it changes, and all that stuff is really cool. And it changes, I get jazzed about the whole sort of history of Australian magazine writers now. I've been really sort of looking into that and going, who are these guys who really, just some people who kind of pioneered the whole thing. And anyway, I'm rambling.
That's cool. How was high school for you? Were you a good student?
No, I was like hopeless, like terrible student who sort of didn't apply himself, and just because I was probably thinking a bit more about other stuff, like just absolutely looking out the window the whole time, and thinking about other things, and but like I really enjoyed it, and I just thought it was such a it was a really massive part of my life. I went to a school called Nashville High. It's now called Bracken Ridge State High, and there was a great bunch of people there. We were really sort of, it wasn't the most highly regarded school, but just the people that I sort of grew up with are just exceptional people, and just really kind of laid the groundwork, the sort of foundations of everything that kind of, I don't know, I saw a lot of the social issues and stuff that sort of I kind of write about now are happening in that school and happening with sort of people in my neighbourhood and people around me and stuff. So that that's probably what I got more out of in terms of, I don't know, in just terms of different. High school's a great way to sort of build for a journo. It's all high school's like just you begin all those things that will help you as a journalist. You begin all those in high school, meeting people, getting inside, sort of, I don't know, observing, you learn all those things.
But did you know at that point that you wanted to be a journalist?
No, not at all. Like, I mean, like I knew that I really admired people like Cameron Crowe, but yeah, I didn't know at all then. I actually genuinely really thought like I'll be happy with like working at the G. James Aluminium and Glass factory, where a lot of this is starting to sound like a Bruce Springsteen song, but it's like it genuinely was a factor. It was just like we just like really didn't see much. And I heard it was like Peter Garrett once. I remember like he said to this thing about the sort of frontier of the outskirts of a city, and that this sort of thing, that this sort of invisible wall, and it gets passed down through generations. And I was quite happy not busting through any kind of wall and just sort of continuing on. But then,
so you finished high school. You had an OP16, I believe.
Yeah. How did you know? How did you possibly know? What have I told you that before? You can only know that by me.
You said it in public. You have said it in public before. In my archives, my Trent Dalton archives.
Yeah, that's right. OP16, and that was sort of bad.
Which, for the record, in Queensland we have between OP1, which is the highest, and 25 is the lowest. So you are in the lower half of that bracket.
Yeah. So and I was pretty even lucky to get OP16. I had this really great maths teacher who I think felt sorry for me, and he really did boost me up from like a D to a C. I don't know whether this was, illegal, but he knew that I wouldn't get into like anything at university if I didn't have this C mark. And this champion man, he sort of did that for me. I don't know. It was just this. I mean, but it was. I think like I was on the edge or something, and he sort of, and by rights I probably should have gotten a D. But this, huge figure in my life. So I've been back to that school and did a talk for. He sort of asked me back to do it like a talk, and I was like, I'll do anything for you, mate. It's like it's probably all because of you that I was anything decent happened in my life. But there's a number of people. But yeah. So OP16 and the only so and that sort of didn't really allow me to do much as far as university went, but I managed to get into a course in USQ, University of Southern Queensland in Toowoomba, and that was like a really great kind of experience going up there and sort of and that's when that was a course called media production, and that was really great in terms of just the fundamentals of journalism. We did radio production, like editing, but it was like editing reel to reel and all that sort of stuff. It was really quite interesting, and then
what year would you have started that?
That was in 1998, because I left school in 1996, and then I went and did I worked for a year for an auto electrical company. Selling auto electrical parts. So this was probably the best thing I could have done. Like, and I'd sort of, I don't know if there's any young potential sort of journos out there listening to this. I really, the idea of stepping away for a bit and doing something completely different and, thinking about exactly what you wanted to do in life. I just thought that this was the best thing. Like my job, there's these little things in a car called a terminal. I don't even know where they go, but they're multicolored. And I used to bag them on a daily basis for 365 days of my life. Every day I bagged into bags of 100 these little terminals that go into a car, and you could either do them by weight or if you wanted to really get it bang on, you'd count them, and we'd sometimes do them by weight, but there'd be a process of you'd have to sometimes count them, and and you're just finding yourself for 8 hours bagging 100 little car terminals into these little bags with our particular auto electrical shop, just a sort of shop in Nudgee, in like industrial Nudgee, and which is on the north side of Brisbane, and that was amazing though for me to think about exactly what I wanted to do, and I came up with a whole lot of sort of cool stuff that year, just because you just had all this time, you're just zoning out, and you're just kind of, I don't know, and I really got out of that year just thinking, yeah, it's done. I am going to go kind of do something to do with writing. I knew after that, because that was brilliant, because you could come home and you hadn't exhausted your sort of thinking brain. Like, the big thing about, the job I have now, you kind of use your thinking brain, from like 8 hours from, in the key hours of the day, and there's not much left sort of creatively, at least for me, at night time, which kind of bothers me sometimes. But that's all right. That's because I love the daytime stuff. But but that job, it was just nothing used of the brain. So you were just really fresh by the time you came home, and I'd be writing like dodgy poetry and like all sorts of stuff. But it was just this idea that you were just sort of expressing, and I really went, I was like, wow, and when you're coming from like counting car electrical terminals, like when you do that, it's just this wonderful freeing thing, because everything that comes from that is gravy, you know what I mean? From that point on, it's all good, it's all good. So you just go, yeah, now I'm just like, that was an extremely freeing year in the sense of like, yeah.
It's amazing to me that, you've always struck me as someone who has a fairly sunny disposition, but the way that you can frame that year not as one of like depression and this job is fucking terrible, what am I doing with my life, at least the way you're telling it now, you've turned it around as something that was really helpful as a buffer between school and your career.
For sure. Even practically, like it gave me the money to get the bond that I needed to go to Toowoomba University, and so it was just this brilliant. I look back on that with such fondness that year, and there was a lot of drinking involved, so you were sort of, it was a fun year. I turned 18 that year, and yeah, it was just like, you're just experiencing life, as you should at 18, and it was brilliant that year. Yeah, but no, that's really nice you say that. I hadn't even thought about that. Yeah, I probably could have. I mean, it wasn't all rosy. I mean, it was a really dank shed in nudgy industrial precinct. But the people I worked with there were just lovely, and they were a family business, and I just learned a lot about that because people were coming into the shop, and and it was a classic place. Like it had the like the calendar up in the back room of the naked ladies and all this sort of stuff, and it was just and it was like pork and gravy sandwiches from the bloody pie van every lunch, but it was just this incredible kind of learning kind of thing where you're seeing all these different facets of life, and and that was always really great, and some of the best kind of learning stuff done in that time. We'd go Friday night 10-pin bowling kind of nights and in the suburbs of Brisbane, and I don't know, there's a lot of great life in that. Yeah.
So you moved to Toowoomba?
Moved to Toowoomba, yeah. Moved in with these art students. That was great. That was like that was like fantastic. So that was like the genuine kind of university experience. I moved in with these, beautiful art students, sort of, who just smoked weed and, and listened to like Ladysmith Mambazo, and we just kind of, and that, yeah, it was just a kind of cool year, and it was like, just a, and I was well and truly out of Brisbane, and that was great as well, because and somehow I actually did manage to kind of still do some kind of a bit of writing type stuff. So it was sort of, and then I built this idea. I really kind of forged the idea that I wanted to really take journalism further and particularly feature writing, and then but that was like just a great sort of learning year in the sense of you again with like artistic creative people around you. Like there's this beautiful girl Lee, and she I came home one day and she'd completely done a sort of mural on our rental house, and just those things, just someone who has the kind of creative spark to just go, I don't really care about the people who own this house. And this was for me like I look back and I remember just being mortified, going, Lee, we're going to have to wash all of this off because this is owned by someone, this house. And but she was just like, oh no, but her art was more important than the landlord. And and I'm sure that landlord, now being a homeowner myself, I'm just like, he would have been so infuriated. But that all that stuff, I just love those people as well. And they were, they were musicians, and we'd sort of start this sort of, we had a garage, and we'd start just do like lame kind of bands that would change its name every month, and singing Nirvana songs. So you were just sort of, it was pretty good days, drinking VB and singing Nirvana songs. Like, if I didn't have a wife and kids, that would be basically what I'd try and do for the rest of my life. So
you were the singer?
It fluctuated, but I was the singer until everyone said you're sounding too much like Eddie Vedder, and then my Eddie Vedder, when I sing Eddie Vedder, sounds too much like Billy Ray Cyrus.
Wow.
It's like, sir, just say it. It's like that. And I was like, it's Billy Ray Cyrus.
Yeah, right.
Not Eddie Vedder. Not the Seattle sound. It's the, I don't know, Texan sound.
Nudgy sound.
It's the nudgy sound. Exactly.
When did you start to think of yourself as a writer?
Kind of, it's a really tough one. Like I don't, it took a long time. Yeah. And I remember talking to another, great friend of mine, Ben Robertson, who I worked with at Brisbane News when I first got my job at Brisbane News, and Ben's a great Brisbane novelist, and he said, and we're talking about this sort of, he said he didn't call himself a writer for a long time, and I just never sort of really called myself or thought of myself as a writer because I hadn't really had anything of note or of any kind of writing, and if I sort of do now, it's probably just as a feature writer. I don't think I'm a writer. It's really strange. I definitely, for the first sort of bit of my career, like I started at Brisbane News, which is like a free colour glossy mag that goes in your letterbox and stuff. And I was, barely thought of myself as a journalist then, even though, it was technically journalism, and it was sort of, but I just had this sort of great, even journalists I thought of, as, even, I always considered, people who were like my heroes, like Cam Stewart and Hadley Thomas and, some other brilliant people, even people I work with right now, like, it just like, and anyway, like, and I just had this big sort of issue with calling myself anything really, but and so I guess, but then, in terms of writing, like, I just thought, well, maybe when someone writes you back some nice letter and says thank you for writing that or something, like, you maybe added something to someone's life, and then maybe so then you can call yourself a writer. But I don't know, I still find it very uncomfortable, because a writer is someone like John Steinbeck, or but no, I guess so. It's a silly thing. I still write. That's what I do. I write for a living.
Yes. Well, I should point out your email signature says Trent Dalton, writer.
Yes. Yeah, that's a funny thing, and I cop heaps of shit about that all the time, because there's like a there's the difference. There's that classic thing, like a hard news journo wouldn't call themselves a writer. They're a journalist, and they do brilliant work as a journalist. And I am definitely very proud of being a journalist now. I'm very comfortable with that, because I feel, but I sort of, I don't even know why. I guess what I'm put on my own sort of, email, it probably just means like staff writer is what I'm trying to say there, like writer on that particular magazine. Like, gotcha. That's what I do, as in, I'm not a layout guy, or I'm not a graphic designer. It's.
I understand.
Yeah,
let's not get hung up on this.
I'm clearly bothered about it. I know. No, it's true. It's a big part of it. Yeah.
All right, let's go back to the chronological narrative. So you had Toowoomba, and then you, I think you worked up enough credit to get to QT for creative writing.
That's right. Yeah.
So you moved back to Brisbane.
Yeah. So I moved back to Brisbane. And that was sort of. Well, that was sort of the beginning of everything, really. Like this great creative writing course. So QT, that was the first year they did it, and now it's a pretty sort of popular course, this one, because it's quite brilliant. I think it's still going. I hope it is, because it's really great. It's a journalism mixed with creative writing sort of course. So it's it's like hard news journalism, learning about that. But also, looking into feature writing, like a dedicated feature writing subject, and put this, this groundbreaking kind of moment for me, and was this woman Chris Olsen, who's now an exceptional Australian writer, and she was writing back then, but she's just in the past kind of 15 years just kicked so many goals. But she was this exceptional feature writing tutor / lecturer. And I remember distinctly, like, she set me a sort of a magazine writing task, and you'd have to do several of these throughout this feature writing subject, and I did a story on tent boxing, and my old man had known he had known a couple of tent boxers, and he put me in touch with one, and so I went up and interviewed this guy about his whole tent boxing career, and and it's. For a feature writer, the colour that is involved in tent boxing is just perfect. It's one of those great, beautiful, boxing. Look at boxing, like the great, talk about the great boxing sort of writers. And another one of the, speaking about people who I really admire, was Norman Mailer, and and any of the stuff that he wrote. But particularly about boxing was pretty spectacular. And so then I started, but and then I love this kind of. I love the idea of an Australian slant on all of these things. So, you can write about the same way someone, some great American magazine writer could write about something. We've got our own little Australian version of that, and its idiosyncrasies and all the colour that comes with that. And anyway, so I did this big tent boxing story.
How many words?
Oh, it was probably like 1,500 maybe, or maybe, yeah. And Chris Olsen. Like this was absolutely like someone picking up a plank of wood and slapping you across the face in a good way, if that can be possible. But she marked that, and she gave it a pretty good sort of mark. But the thing I remember is she wrote at the bottom of this, and it was like light bulb moment. She wrote like, Trent, comma, this is what you should be doing. That's like, it's just like, wow, like it was just like someone grabbing your head and just going, yeah, this is what you should be doing. It's like, you just don't, even though like I was doing sort of going down that road, I didn't know, sort of where it was going to go or what I was, looking to do. And she just sort of spelled it out. And like, that is an exceptional gift that she sort of gave me, in the sense of like going, look, you should pursue this further, you should take this further and take it as far as you can, and that was just brilliant, and that was a real massive moment in my life. And then so I never sort of finished my degree or anything. And no, the Brisbane News, great sort of glossy colour magazine in Brisbane, the editor at the time, Judith Ann Gerasimov, was looking for a sort of a young, sort of, you might say, a dog's body kind of type shit kicker journo to just do all the kind of fill all the spaces and stuff, and kind of do what they were calling the bookends at the time, which were they'd have these like 10 different little squares and rectangles on the page that basically filled space when an ad wouldn't be big enough, or someone wouldn't buy enough ad space, and so there'd be like a yawning sort of 10 centimeter rectangular space that needed to be filled. And we'd fill them with these things called personal taste, or another one we came up with was like, the best book I read in my life was ... and all this sort of stuff. But that was a great sort of start, in the sense, because I was just writing like property pages, and writing. It was just like such a fun job, in the sense of it was just everything. That job, it became like just you'd do anything on that magazine, and such a great sort of grounding for any journo, because it was just you do, especially for a feature writer, because it was just a lot of feature writing, and but on a lot of different topics, and that was so sort of really good sort of education for me. And
to join the dots, Chris Olsen recommended you for that role. Yeah,
sorry, that's what I was about to say. So Chris, I think, and another great woman who was at QUT, Susan Hetherington, and I think either one of them was sort of basically might have forwarded my name. And then I was at home like on the holidays of uni that year, and I'd taken a job as with Australia Post. I was working for Australia Post like as a mail sorter, so you have to, and that was this amazing Christmas where I had to learn every postcode for every suburb in Queensland.
What?
Yeah, and you had to memorize it, and you'd get the job if you could rattle all of the postcodes off in a certain given amount of time, and you'd get a Christmas job. So Christmas is their big season, obviously, because everyone's sending mail, and you'd get put on the night shift. And that was it. And these letters would come in, and you just have to go. My visuals aren't quite working on the podcast, but
well, funnily enough, I have done that exact same job.
No,
in Bundaberg.
You're kidding.
In, let's say, 2005, 2006.
Yeah,
just before university. End of high school, before university, at Christmas time, peak period, standing around a table, someone dumps a bag of mail on the table. People standing around it, and you've got to sort it into various spots.
That's it.
Such a mundane job.
It is so mundane. That is so mundane, and it's like such long hours too. And you're always going home on the train like at broad, morning daylight, and you're just going, "What sort of vampiric life am I leading right now?"
Yeah.
But,
So you took the job with Australia Post, but this other one came up.
Yeah. So I'd sort of come back. And just those defining sort of moments. I remember I was watching Oprah Winfrey and Michelle Harvey, the secretary for Brisbane News. Really lovely lady. She called up and said, Trent, would you like to come in for an interview at Brisbane News? And I was like, what? Yeah, of course. I'd love to. And then I went in and got interviewed by Judith Ann Gerasimov and Elspeth Costello, who are, dear friends of mine, and now. And, and it was just, that was great. That was a whole period, that job was so good. I sort of really got very comfortable there, and and it was it was.
So what year did you first start there?
So 2000, and I worked there till 2006, I think ish.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
so that was your very first writing job.
Yeah.
Can I ask what the salary was? Your opening salary as a writer?
Yeah, it was $26,000. Yeah, which is sort of I guess it was all right money to me, but it was sort of I was living in a place. It's all good. It's all great because I was living in one of these like a half house with this brilliant ex-British soldier named Tommy, who was an old kind of like 80-year-old drunk who used to talk to his cat, like scream at his cat and have these massive conversations with his ginger cat, and and it was just sort of like this great time because you're sort of you're not on the best money or anything, but you're just sort of you've got enough to pay your rent in this little sort of half house kind of thing I had, and that's that job. I mean, that job was amazing. I made so many great friends, and met my wife. So it was that was a huge job.
It made you. It made your.
Yeah. Well, that
your life partner. That's amazing.
Yeah, well, exactly. Like, and I'm big on all these moments of that you might have missed out on. Those terrifying things that you think about and just go, oh man, if I missed that, if I didn't do that, and it just terrifies me. And there are a million of those as far as that getting to that road to get to that magazine, and it just really does sort of scare the life out of me to think, all the things that came from that job. Yeah.
So you started as a dog's body, being, you'd get told to write something and you'd do it.
Yeah.
But did you start to build some ambition or some goals for what you wanted to be doing within that publication?
Yeah, like I was doing a lot of, started to do a lot of music stuff, which was great. Like I still treasure music, and so. Well, that job was massive because I've still got this box of tapes of all my Brisbane News music interviews, and I'm telling you, the names in that box are really great. We're talking like Billy Bragg and both Tim and Neil Finn, who are just gods to me, and just all sorts of. I'm talking the craziest kind of names, but because you do those, as you would know, those kind of. Those 15-minute kind of churn and burn type interviews, but you might do a phoners. Like I interviewed Coldplay when I didn't even know who the hell they were, and and all that stuff, all those bands that come through and then go big, and but you catch them because they're coming out on their first little sort of mini tour, or they've done their little EP or something, and you get to chat to them, and then you write a couple of those, and then but I guess the big sort of thing changed me on that job was we started doing kind of movie star interviews, which was kind of hadn't been done too much, and then that kind of really kick-started through this great Brisbane film PR woman named Michelle Vecchio, who just was really sweet and just gave Brisbane News a shot at interviewing some of the big guns who were coming into Australia, and then we sort of went down. We did one on Renee Zellweger, and that went all right, despite some classic sort of things, and that became really enjoyable to me because you were seeing all these really big name people, up close, and that's sort of the beauty of colour really came to me doing that. Like you'd see, Renee Zellweger had gone through this horrible flight over to go to Sydney, that particular sort of press tour. And because she was in a bad mood because she'd picked up a New Idea magazine in which she featured in the Stars Without Makeup section, and they were ribbing her about what she looked like without makeup. So then she refused to wear makeup through our photo shoot, but yet we wanted to get her for like our front cover of our magazine. And I was working with this brilliant photographer, Justine Walpole, who had to get, and we did this a number of times. We had to go down and get they'd give us like 10 minutes, we'd get like 8-minute interview, 2 minutes to get a cover shot for Brisbane News. I shit you not. Wow. Justine Walpole could get a cover shot in 2 minutes, and she did it time and time again. She was amazing. Like she'd do the setting up in the hotel room, as I'm like, chatting to, some movie star, and she'd be frantically sorting out her lighting, and then the movie star would sort of just go. She'd have people posing in the seat so she could just nail it on, a few shots, and then every time she nailed it. She was amazing under pressure, like one of the greatest photographers ever worked with. Just ringing a bell now, Justin Morpler, who, mind you, is has the greatest photographer's story, because she got plucked by Prince. I'm talking Prince, that Prince, and to come to Paisley Park and be like Prince's photographer for 3 months, because he dug some shots that she did in Brisbane at like a show he did, and he loved them, and oh man, and I just I've sort of been getting into Prince a lot lately, like his guitar and stuff, and I just think wow. And so the experiences she's had hanging out with Prince are just extraordinary.
I'm writing that name in my notebook.
And in terms of things like playing 3 a.m. ping pong with Prince, and Prince is actually like an athletic genius. Would you believe?
He plays basketball.
He does. Have you seen the great Eddie Murphy story? The great Dave Chappelle Eddie Murphy.
No.
It's just extraordinarily funny skit that Dave Chappelle does, and it's basically Eddie Murphy's brother recounting tales of what it was like. Charlie Murphy talking about what it was like hanging out with his brother Eddie in the 80s.
Yeah.
And one particular night, Eddie Murphy's crew meet up with Prince's crew, and Eddie's all being sort of all cocky and like going, this guy's such a pussy, this Prince and stuff. And then Prince goes, how about we play a game of b-ball? And they go back to Paisley Park, and basically have this game of basketball. And Prince comes out dressed like the full kit, like a total Harlem Globetrotter, and he just smashes them, just works them, and he's just like a basketball genius. And Eddie realizes that if Prince didn't become this rock god, he could have easily made sort of representative basketball. So Prince, he's the man.
Okay, just on that topic of interviewing celebrities, whether on the phone or in person, were you shitting yourself at that stage? Or how did you approach those tasks each time?
Yeah, definitely. Like, I really did shit myself. Those ones where you'd be flown down. So I was probably like 22 or something, and you'd be flown down, and you see all these people like David Stratton would be there, all these people who were sort of like film type people, and then you've got to come back with something with enough to make to justify the trip. That was basically the biggest kind of concern for me, is that this is a lot of trouble that someone else has paid for, and so maybe I should try and make this work. And and I mean, they were just I was always really, and I was always very prepared, and some classic times I'd be sort of over prepared, and I was a bit of a pushover, probably, like just because of that kind of overwhelmed by the situation, and the some really aggressive Hollywood type PR people, just total sort of just could crush you with their just their egos alone, and and it was really funny, because I used to turn up with like reams of questions, like just in case they decided that the chat would go beyond 8 minutes to maybe like 180 minutes, and and so I'd list them like most important first, and then you'd have like really obscure ones like Anthony Hopkins. What was it like? What sort of fabric was the material of the prison suit you wore in Silence of the Lambs? Just crap, and then it was really funny, and just overly prepared. And then that interview in particular was like just a really sort of life-changing journalistic experience. You're cacking yourself. But like that was a really funny one, because and this was a huge moment for me in the sense that I was a big fan of Anthony Hopkins, and Silence of the Lambs was one of those books actually my dad gave me when I was a kid. I don't know why he was giving me Silence of the Lambs at like 15. Read this about this weird transvestite psycho killer. And anyway, but yeah, so it came time. Yeah, we got to chat to Anthony Hopkins. Unbeknownst to me, you know, Anthony had sort of broken up from his wife, and he was getting over some sort of, you know, maybe some kind of drinking kind of issue that he might have had, and he wasn't in the best of moods. And then just the funniest thing was, like, I had this ream of sort of questions, and then Anthony's kind of agent picked up my sheets of paper it was like the lobby of the Hotel Intercontinental in Sydney, and there were all these really kind of established film writers there, and yeah, this sort of press kind of agent for Anthony picked up my questions and dead set pulled out the mightiest red pen. It was like shaped like a baseball bat, and she just started like slashing at my questions, doing massive crosses, saying, "You won't ask this, you won't ask this, you won't be asking this." And it was this really sort of first time I was confronted with the idea that, like, yeah, hang on, they're not helping you, they're helping them, and kind of they're actually the enemy. They're kind of they're there to ruin your story. They're there to give you a crap story, and that was a really sort of eye-opening sort of thing. And then I went in to interview Anthony, basically with no questions, because each of my questions had been kind of scribbled all over. And I actually walked. I think she gave me back the questions, and it just looked like I'd sort of been handed back an exam that I did really badly on. And anyway, so I went into this room, and Anthony Hopkins is like sitting there, pretty intimidating guy, like, you know, and like Hannibal Lecter, and he's sitting there, and he goes, "You have these Black Widow spiders," and what's the blue? What's our blue? Yeah, is it
funnel web?
Funnel web. What, yeah, he goes, "You have these. What are these? You have these funnel web spiders. They can." And I go, yeah. And I said it like that. I was like, "Funnel web?" And he goes, "Yes, that's it. They get you when you're hanging out your clothes." And he was fascinated with these funnel web spiders. I swear, I had 8 minutes with Sir Anthony, and he spent 4 minutes talking about funnel web spiders. And then moved on to box jellyfish, other sort of venomous creatures, and then I managed to sort of get him around to acting, and then, you know, and he dead set said, "Acting, it's a load of shit. You know, it's bullshit. It's nothing." And he just said it's nothing. Like, he was just going, "It's meaningless crap," and, you know, and so you know, and yeah, I sort of, so after about 7 minutes, all I had to build a 2,000 word story, cover story for Brisbane News was "Acting is shit," Anthony says, and yeah, so it was a good start. But then, yeah, and then what came of that though was this sort of idea, just through necessity and desperation, was building the scene, you know, and I learned a lot about, you know, that actions can speak louder than words, and that was a really great feature writing kind of thing I learned that day out of desperation, and that there was a lot of fun actually in everything swirling around that 8 minutes. You know, there's a great 2,000 word story, even better than anything he probably could have said. Was the fact that he was, you know, picking the gunk from his fingernails, and you know, and throwing it near my kneecap, you know, and you know, it's just like, wow, what does that say about a guy? Or, you know, what does it say about his mood at the time, and or his temperament, or, you know, what sort of guy he is? And he turned out being okay, but it was just such, and you realise, like, if they're pissed off, that's not such a bad thing, you know, or yeah, it all works, you know, it's all good, yeah, it's all interesting, yeah, to a reader.
There's kind of a preface to that story. Don't know if this is true, or this is just like journalistic license, but is it true that for a time you used to, before a big interview, you'd go to the bathroom and look in the mirror and say something?
Ah, this is true, yeah, that's true, yeah, totally, like, that is a big thing, like that. And this all harps back to, you know, my sort of basic inadequacies as a human being, and that's just my discomfort with myself as I've moved through the world. But I used to say this sort of mantra, and it was from Reservoir Dogs, and you know, yeah, and it goes, they don't know you, they don't know a fucking thing, you're a fucking Beretta. And Tim Roth says that basically he's like an undercover cop, and, you know, and he needs to sort of seal the deal on a sting, and he's scared shitless, and yeah, and it's something he says to himself in the mirror. And then so before that interview, I've written about this, and it's sort of before that interview I said that mantra,
They don't know shit.
They don't know shit. That's right. And you know, and it was sort of, yeah, and it was just something I used to say to psych myself up. As in, they don't know shit. As in, like, don't be scared. Don't be scared of Anthony Hopkins, or, you know, it's that classic thing, you know, like an actor looking down at the stage, at the audience, and seeing them all naked or something. You know, just sort of try and pare it all back. They're just human like you, and all that. And that's what that was about. But I used to say that before, like, big, like, job interviews, and you know, like, it sounds so stupid, but it was like dead set a thing, and you just, like, you get yourself all set, and then you say that, and the key bit is you're a fucking Beretta, you know, like, yeah. And I misquoted Tim Roth because he actually says you're a fucking Beretta, as in the 70s, like, cop show, which I later discovered. But I sort of just love the idea that it was like a Beretta, like a gun, like you're a gun. Just like, you know, you go in there, man, and be a gun, be like a Beretta. And then, yeah, and sometimes that worked. Like, you go in there and just not be the guy who's wondering whether, you know, he's a journalist or a writer yes. or a, you know, whatever. You know, like, that's just ridiculous. But these are those stupid thoughts. But you can't have that stuff when you go in there and, you know, interviewing some guy. Yeah. So that's what that was all about.
When did you stop doing that? What was the last time you did that?
Wow. Yeah. You know what? That's a really great question. I probably stopped doing it when I kind of got a bit more comfortable with the fact that, like, you can handle a situation, you know, if no matter what. But, you know, even to be honest, like, I'd still do a version of it when I'd, like, have something really massive. Let's say, like, you know, if it's like a really high flying politician or something like that, you might say something like that. Or I don't think I would voice the whole sort of, you know, stupid kind of, you know, mantra now, but I would still definitely look in the mirror and just go, you know, I don't know, you know, some sort of game face kind of thing, you know, like, come on, yeah, no, yeah, don't, you know, almost telling myself, don't worry, but, you know, go in, just do it, just go in and sort of, you know, make this happen and have a great chat with someone. Like, gee, I know it's not like, you know, I don't know, you know, a world chess championship or something. You're just going to chat to someone, but yeah, I don't know. Yeah, but I probably stopped doing it around, you know, probably Q Weekend days. Like, I got a job on this amazing magazine, Q Weekend, and you sort of start. I don't know, that got some really great kind of readers, and people would sort of go, hey, you know, you guys are doing some cool stuff. So when you start sort of becoming a bit more confident, and that's just a confidence thing, yeah. So I probably didn't feel like I needed to sort of lift myself up so much, because I was, you know, yeah, you go, okay, no, I know I can do this now because, you know, yeah, I've written, you know, enough of these type of things where you go, you know, I'm fairly comfortable with this, yeah. But I'll probably say it now more in, you know, parent-teacher interviews.
They don't know shit.
They don't know shit. You're a fucking Beretta. Mrs. Hitsky doesn't care. Yeah. Anyway, that's funny.
Tell me about that transition to Q Weekend, because you were there at the beginning. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So describe Q Weekend for someone who may not know it.
So Q Weekend is this brilliant sort of colour magazine insert that goes in the Courier Mail each Saturday, and you know, filled with really intriguing feature articles, you know, crossing all, you know, topics, hard news, sport, film, music, you know, popular culture, the whole work. So that was sort of I'd heard that this thing was happening, which was a really sort of, I don't know, it was a pretty groundbreaking thing at the time, in the sense not a lot of this had happened in Queensland before, a sort of magazine of the style of the Weekend Australian magazine or Good Weekend. And I was really keen on getting a job on it, and to the point where I was kind of obsessive, and like, because I really felt like, you know, yeah, I just thought it was just something that could be great. And I knew I could sort of give it a pretty good shot if I had a chance to get on it, and so, yeah, I'd heard that this thing was happening, and I just sort of put it, yeah, and I think they were advertising for, you know, anyone to have a shot at sort of, you know, putting in a resume and stuff, and yeah, and then I obsessively went about doing like dummy pages and stuff of potential columns I could write, and all sorts of, yeah, it was just like, because I think the whole thing about it was that it was what was so exciting is that it was something new. Like, you could come along and go, hey, well, you know, yeah, and like help add to, you know, it being the cool thing that it became. And and so I put in this.
That kind of harks back to your, was it your teenage years of making magazines?
Yeah. Andrew, I hadn't even put that together. Yeah, and you know what? Yeah, that it really kind of does. And there's this program, I don't even know whether it exists now, called Quark. It's a computer program that we used to use at Brisbane News. And my beautiful wife was really good on it. And you know, I'd send her all these, you know, fictional columns that I like, these sort of things that didn't even exist, but she'd help me put them, sort of lay them out into, you know, with pictures and words. And by the end, we had this dummy page where it was like a sample of things that I'd love to write as bookends for Q Weekend, and then and then just put together a whole big sort of portfolio and jagged an interview with. As it was a fascinating thing, I got a phone call from someone saying, "Thanks, but no thanks. Like, we got your portfolio. You know, we're going with, you know, someone else." So I was really bummed, and then I got a call back like sort of a week later, and it said, "Actually, would you like to come in for an interview?" So I don't know. I have to ask the great Christine Middap what happened in that intervening week one day. I don't know what did happen, but you know, I got a sit down with, you know, the woman who I think is like the greatest magazine editor, you know, in Australia and possibly the world. I don't know too many other global editors though to judge, but I think, and I don't know. She sat down with her, and she was I don't know, she was just great and really enthusiastic about what this thing could be, and you know, and I was just like, I was just telling her how much I wanted to just really just go and just. It was all about, back then I remember I just wanted to go and like do things like really enthusiastically. Or I just remember just saying things like, I want to go do a story in a, you know, a mental health ward and stay there for a week, or, you know, it was all about that sort of stuff. And I really wanted to get across to her that is the type of journalism I'd love to do. And anyway, and I sort of got a job again as sort of a guy writing the kind of bookends and the smaller kind of bits on the magazine. And that was 2006, and that was like probably, you know, pre-kids, like the best year of my life. It's just amazing time working with people who, like, I'd been you know, Russell Shakespeare, you know, the Weekend Australian, he was a Weekend Australian magazine photographer who did these Signs of Life photographs, this little box they used to have called Signs of Life, and you know, I used to look at his photographs and just go, man, this guy's amazing. And you know, he was working on that magazine, and people like David Kelly, who's a very good friend of mine now, and you know, and then these amazing writers like Matt Condon, Lisa Scott, you know, and it was just an incredible time, with like brilliant editorship and really exciting time that was. So
suddenly you were grouped with a series of really dedicated feature writers. So you had kind of crossed the path, although you weren't writing features immediately, but you had entered into this world that you had first read in that bottom bunk at Bracken Ridge. So you're well on your way to joining those dots. And
like that was really you're right, like it was really special, and that's right, it was a magazine dedicated to the idea, to what that was, you know, to long form journalism, and that you know, and I hadn't even sort of realised, you know what that can do, or what that, you know, what it can bring to the sort of the whole journalism framework, you know, and that was really cool, because and I was watching people like how Matt would do a story and how he'd approach it, and you know, how he'd call a whole bunch of sources, or you know, just, and then hearing him like sitting across from me, but hearing him putting a story together. And jagging a source, or you know, and just making a breakthrough, and then making a sort of what would become a narrative breakthrough, and then you go, wow, and then reading the finished product of how he put it all together, even sitting in on editorial meetings where everyone's discussing this, and the editor Christine's talking about where she'd like to take the story, and then seeing how it would end up, and all the input from everyone, and man, it was so exciting. It was such an amazing thing to watch, and then you know, people really got into it, and like readers really sort of got on board and went, you know, look, you guys keep doing this, we'll sort of read it, and it became a really cool thing. It was a great time.
Were you doing Ordinary People from the start?
So that was
describe Ordinary People.
Ordinary People was the weekly kind of bookend that where it was about a 550 word first person piece, where basically each week I'd go out and interview an ordinary person. So ordinary, you know, Queenslander, And the whole idea of it was, you know, the extraordinary in the ordinary, and that just really, that actually kind of really kind of set the compass for a lot of the journalism that I do, you know, for, you know, years after that. And because I got really fascinated with just the ordinary sort of stories that were out there, but that were in fact extremely, you know, insanely kind of interesting. And yeah, so you'd go interview, I don't know, a stop-go woman and get her whole life story, or you'd go interview, it was just endless. It was, you know, someone who you know, a bus driver, or it was endless. You could pluck someone off the street, and it was really in that, you know, that great sort of, you know, that Front Up show that used to be on SBS. It was just really that whole idea that everyone has a story to tell if you just take the time to hear it. And we do sort of sit down for, like, you know, hour and a half with someone, you know, who just, you'd stop walking out of a shop, you know, and it was just brilliant. It was such a fascinating thing. And then all these revelations would come out of it. You know, a guy who makes artificial limbs for a living, or it just went on and on. Or you know, a young goth kid who's talking about, you know, his fears in life, and it just got. I just loved it because it was just this forum where someone could just really share, but I could sort of also just learn about all these different types of people, and yeah, it was amazing, that whole sort of, like, as far as like my job on Q Weekend, that was a really special thing, a little special baby that kind of was a real something that I really kind of that was very kind of special, and I tried to sort of honor in some way, you know, like, and make sure each one of them, each story that went in there was just some ridiculous, you know, some amazingly kind of ridiculous true story. So each week, you know, the even the deputy editor Kathy Osmond, she would go, she'd go, oh my God, I can't believe this person. We'd go over and talk about various things, like she'd help sort of fix some wording and stuff, and yeah, and she'd just be sort of blown away by this person's story, and yeah, and that would make me feel great. And then so I go, all right, I'm gonna even do someone even more interesting next time, and yeah, and it became this really great thing. We used to get some really nice feedback on it, just from people going, look, I really appreciate you telling these ordinary people's stories, and that was a really groundbreaking thing too for me, in the sense of, like, well, of course, like Angelina Jolie isn't, you know, the most interesting person in the world, you know, your next door neighbour is, you know, and yeah, so that was a really great kind of thing to work on.
And it was a weekly deadline too. You had to do that each week.
Yeah, well, all the bookends, like, so they had to, yeah, that's right, that was a genuine, yeah, that's right, you'd write a whole bunch of bookends, yeah, and they'd have to be, and a pretty frequent, so the start of it, I'd just be churning out bookends, yeah, just, you know, and that was fun though too. We used to have, you know, a column called Latitude, where you'd call up a small town and basically call, you know, the local mechanic, the local, you know, publican, and get them to give you insights into that small town, you know, and that was great, you know. Where we had this other thing called the Big Q, where you'd just ask scientists, you know, interesting questions, and yeah, it was just great. So that was, you know, my job was to sort of fill those spaces, and then sort of do the odd small little maybe feature here and there, you know, and yeah, you get that opportunity, and then, you know, it just all sort of builds. And
yeah, I hadn't realised until now, and just you saying that Ordinary People was so influential, and it makes a lot of sense, right? You're out there week after week talking to people, hearing their stories, and your mind goes in all sorts of different ways when you hear these stories, and they can tap into ideas that you pursue down the track.
For sure. Oh, absolutely. That's right. So that's right. And you'd get an Ordinary People, and you go, oh, I definitely need to write about that somewhere down the track. Yeah, that's right. And thus began the kind of this document that is now ridiculously sort of large in my, you know, computer file of story ideas, where you're just like endless, you know, from doing that, just going out onto the street and talking to someone, and that was great. That was a gold mine. And then, yeah, that's right. And then there'd be times you'd go back to Christine and go, you know, yeah, we should really take this bigger, and, you know, this might be something. She'd go, yeah, turn that into like a 3,000 word piece. Yeah.
So tell me about that transition between bookends to features. Do you remember your first feature for Q Weekend?
First feature for Q Weekend was a story I wrote about. Actually, the first kind of feature was a small little bit that was part of a bigger feature on that movie, The Proposition, that Nick Cave wrote. the first proper feature I wrote was probably this story on goanna oil. Goanna oil, the sort of balm, that sort of multi-cure-all balm that people put on like sore elbows and cuts and grazes and things, and it's got this incredible sort of story in the history of Queensland about this snake salesman who went out, in outback Queensland and developed and saw the Aborigines using this goanna oil on soothing various ailments through this goanna oil. Anyway, so I tracked down the history of goanna oil and the family history, and it turned into this sort of rollicking kind of historical yarn, and that was the first, and my editor kind of thought it was okay, and then that led to probably the next one I did. Not long after that, I did this story where it was, I'd go back to, had to pretend it was 1979, which was sort of insanely fun. That was just a ridiculously fun kind of week where I hired out this old statesman and went to drive-ins and pretended like I was a 1970s sort of dude getting around dressed like John Travolta or something. But it was really fun. It was just this great, funny kind of experiment that turned into something really interesting. And so that, and then it was basically make an idea or be given a great idea by Christine, and you'd go write these feature articles, and that was sort of just a truly kind of crazy, brilliant period where in the magazine was like you're just being inspired. Like you'd read a story and you go, oh wow, that was amazing, and then so by one of your colleagues, and then we'd all try and write something better than that, and there was a lot of cool feedback coming in of people just going, keep going, it's just that classic thing, like don't stop, just keep sort of broadening your horizons. And Christine was brilliant at just going, yep, where can we take this, like just do more, let's do something really edgy, and it'd be just some crazy kind of even design wise, and people like Sandy Bressick, who was just like this mad designer who just mad in the kind of awesome sense, like just really creative, doing like really edgy stuff. And it was like this magazine from Queensland, people going, wow, that's a pretty good read,
So you started that story ideas document while at Q Weekends?
Yeah, probably going right back to Brisbane News did, though. Right. Yeah, because Brisbane News was like, you'd have to churn out a whole bunch of... That was a sort of a really... Like, as far as deadlines, Brisbane News had massive... You'd write a lot in Brisbane News. Like, it was... You're writing, probably bookends as well as features. I was probably writing about, maybe 4,000, 5,000 words a week, and it was just a real churn to sort of... You just had to keep it coming, and there were maybe 4 full-time writers, so you'd be doing one big feature, like a big cover feature, and then you do smaller kind of popular culture type one-on-one interviews, and then as well as the bookends. So that whole idea, you definitely started to be wise to really keep a story idea folder. So like everything, like put everything on it. Doesn't even matter how lame that idea is, just put it down, because when you might mention it to someone, they'll make it better. And that was a great kind of thing too.
When you started doing features full-time for Q Weekends, tell me about your approach to being on assignment. So if you're out there reporting a topic, what are you looking for? What goes into your notebook?
Definitely, I'm always going for the killer context, you might say, like just the killer context. So, if you're in the outback, everyone's seen red dirt, but like maybe make it a bit more specific, or and that can be everything. It's just like everything you see, but also just that thing that separates it from our sort of existing knowledge. So and then always just jotting down, like everything visual that the words won't tell the person, or that the person's quotes won't say. So as they're talking, so keep the dictaphone on, but be jotting down, let the dictaphone take all the words, but you be taking down all the notes. That's sort of how I would do it. Let the I'd take a recorder, do all, make sure all that's sort of covered and the sound's all right, all on that, and then use your notepad to just take absolutely everything down. Photos on the wall, the hairs on the you know, on the knuckles of their hands, you know, or, you know, just all sorts of, you know, whatever. Yeah, it can be anything, but also just the things they're doing, like smiling, crying, yeah, all that, and yeah, just endless, like absolutely everything, like that sort of idea. And that was a very Matt Condon kind of thing. He was very good at that, like detail, you know, just like really detailed. I really loved that about his writing, just really detailed, like just really put the reader there. And that was sort of the big thing I really tried to start to do, and I still try and do with most things, yeah. And just like detail, like just, you know, is the guy flicking the top of a, you know, the Coke can, or is he sort of, I don't know, you know, you learn so much about the way someone decorates their house, or what's in their video collection, or, you know, it's very voyeuristic probably, but yeah, definitely just noting all sorts of things.
What about interviewing? Do you go in with prepared questions, or blank slate, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, probably somewhere in between, like a few prepared, and then just fumbling my way to a point as well, like, so yeah, but definitely prepared, you know, but totally willing to go off topic, like, you know, and that great moment when the window opens up and they let you a little bit in, and then going in further. So that's probably even more important, I always felt. And just definitely having a few things to go back to, just in that rare moment that you probably don't even want this happening too much, but that rare moment when you do just sort of get lost, and you just like, or you know, like there's just a pause in the conversation, it's not flowing as naturally as you'd hope, then have something to go back to. Yeah, and that was always helpful, you know. But those ordinary peoples was just total free-flowing conversation, which made it so freeing and such a wonderful exercise, because it was all discovery, and there's a power in that too, like in an interview situation, like not being too worded up. There's a great podcast called The Nerdist. I don't know if you know The Nerdist. Do you know that guy? Yeah, and he was interviewing Paul McCartney. And every interview I've ever sort of read or seen with Paul McCartney, you know, because we know the McCartney mythology and the Beatles mythology so well, everyone's always super prepared. And this guy who interviewed McCartney on The Nerdist was kind of like a super fan, but wasn't overly prepared and didn't ask overly specific music type questions. So McCartney was there just telling stories that I'd never heard him tell, because this guy was just taking a slightly different approach and almost discovering Paul McCartney again. You know what I mean? Like there's a beauty in discovering someone for yourself, and not sort of just going in with all these pre-read ideas, you know, like where you've just already know so much about the guy. But and because conversation works on a series of natural discoveries, you know, so you're just going, wow, that's really interesting, and that shows, you know, in your interest when you have made a genuine discovery about someone, and then it builds upon that. But if you know every last thing there is to know about this person, and you're just working your way through them by the numbers, and there hasn't been any sense on both parties that there's been a real sense of revelation or some sense of learning from both sides, yeah, you know, then that can, yeah, that doesn't really help. But this guy interviewing McCartney, you know, and McCartney started talking to this guy as if we didn't know the mythology. So he'd start saying things like, well, you know, John and I were playing in this place called the Cavern, and I was like, wow, he started speaking about it, like forgetting that the world doesn't know this whole, you know, have this encyclopedic knowledge of all the events in that band's history. But it was beautiful to hear him talk about it as if it was just, you know, he was saying it for the first time. You know, we went to this place called Hamburg, you know. I was like, wow, yeah, you know, cool, yeah.
Tell me about, during interviews, how you handle emotional moments, because your writing has always struck me as having a high quotient of empathy. You're very empathic to your subjects, and that really comes across in the writing. I want to know how, if someone becomes emotional for whatever reason during an interview, how do you deal with that? And one story in particular that I'm thinking of is losing Matty. So
wow.
Perhaps you could give us some context on that story.
Yeah. Oh, wow, that's a great... I'm glad, you know, like that is a really important story to me, that losing Matty story, and it's probably a good example of that kind of emotional kind of stuff. But losing Matty, yeah, it was about, this amazing family, the Stanley family, and Paul Stanley, who's I guess he's just a great man and a great friend of mine now. But I hadn't really known him, but he was starting he since went on to build this campaign, which was a one punch campaign to basically raise awareness of the idea that one punch can kill. So a young bunch of young teenage blokes go to a party, get into a fight, on the terps, and one guy swings a punch and it lands. You can actually kill that guy, and which is essentially what happened to his son Matty. And and that interview sort of came at a really sort of, everyone was a lot swirling around that story at the time, and that was just a matter of, it was a great lesson in the whole idea of multiple catch-ups, for one thing. Getting to know someone, start at somewhere neutral. It started at the Jubilee Hotel. I was having a beer and Paul was having a Diet Coke, and because, as he said, if he started drinking around that time of his life, it would have been very dangerous for him. And then you talk to him. It was just really a lot of talking about how we might do the story together, and that's a really kind of sometimes powerful thing with a story like that. Just going, hey, how would you like to approach a story like this? I know this is this tragic story in your life, and so I'm not going to go in there with like a tornado and just sort of tear up the place, and then it was sort of just building that trust and building that relationship, and then it gives me chills thinking about that whole journey of that, because it basically ended with Kay, Matthew's beautiful mum, who sort of hadn't really spoken about the whole thing, and just through our series of catch-ups, just by the very nature that Paul and I were constantly talking about the stories. So going down to his back sort of table down his backyard in suburban Brisbane, and just constantly sort of just unpicking his emotions about it, but basically me just there listening, doing nothing more than listen. And and slowly Kay would come up and listen to one of these chats herself, and then next thing after a while she sits down, and then after a while longer she's contributing to the conversation. And that had been and then Paul sort of says after, like, he turns to me and says, that's the first time I've seen Kay speak about it, and I just like, and then so that's an immensely kind of emotional kind of thing. But I to answer the question, I like it absolutely, just respecting that moment that they're doing you this kind of great honor, and that this by sharing of themselves. And I really truly sort of as far as empathy and stuff, it's probably just built from just this utter gratitude that they're sharing the story. And then definitely trying to see how they're dealing with that and trying to put yourself in their shoes, the classic empathy kind of model. But and that was it with that one. It was definitely, but he was an exceptional human being. I've not interviewed many people like Paul, even since, because he was a very deeply sort of emotional guy, made even more kind of wise by the circumstances of how that all happened, and even just to know him over the years and see how his philosophies have sort of evolved is really fascinating. And but that was really kind of early days, really huge, heavy kind of feature to write. And the way that he was so gracious really just was just dumbfounded me. And we finished our last chat for that story, and my eldest daughter was about to be born, and we went out to my car out the front of his house. I'll never forget it. She was probably maybe she was 2 weeks away from being born. I was about to write the story, and then I'd go on holidays to sort of basically be with my wife as she gives birth to our first kid. And Paul, who's just lost his eldest son, we're leaning back on our car, and he just puts a hand on my shoulder and he just goes, "Mate, it's the best thing you'll ever do." And I just thought, wow, like he was saying, it's just talking about fatherhood, and what a privilege and what a wonder it is, and here's a guy who's just sort of lost this beautiful kid. And I just thought, man, like, I'll take that into fatherhood, and I'll, and yeah, it was just this incredible time. And then that story ran almost day after my daughter was born, and you know, one of the first people to send me, you know, congratulations on the birth of my daughter was Paul Stanley, the guy whose, you know, face I just sort of, you know, we'd splashed on this in this magazine in this really, you know, really delicate, beautiful kind of way too. It was really well done by everybody, and in terms of like design and the headline and everything, and you know, he was really appreciative. Yeah, but it just, it really helps remind you about the whole, you know, how kind of privileged the whole job is, you know, that you're sitting down with these people and that's their moment to kind of, I know, and sometimes, you know, you're the only person they might have spoken to about something. So I don't know, that's all I do, is just respect that fact that is, you know, that it's happening now, like this is being processed, you know, for them, and that's a really rare thing.
That story won you Best Feature at Queensland Media Awards in 2008. I believe that was your first journalism award. And you have since won quite a few more, which we won't go into now because you have a call to make in about 10 minutes. But I did want to ask you, because you have become so renowned for your feature writing, and as a result, you've probably had a lot of smoke blown up your ass. How do you stay grounded? Who keeps you grounded?
You know, definitely my wife, who, you know, I'm constantly rattling introduction ideas to. Like I'll say, "Hey, Fee, what do you think about this introduction?" And she'll go, "That's crap," or she'll be really sort of blunt and say, "Look, you know, I don't think that was your best," you know. That's just this beautiful honesty. And you know, my mum is just brutal. She will actually go, you know, you might have rushed that one a bit, or and then but you know, on the flip side of that, when she says something sort of, you know, that's vaguely kind of complimentary of a story, it really means a lot, because she doesn't give praise easily. So but yeah, definitely, but I'm glad you think I've stayed grounded. Sometimes I think
I didn't say you have stayed grounded.
Yeah. You didn't actually say that. No, like it's, I just think it's really important to not take that stuff too seriously. Mind you, it does, but you know, it does help me personally. It helps me a lot, because it helps, you know, just sort of let you know that you're on the vaguely the right track, you know, and that someone might have appreciated it. So, you know, it's not nothing for me, but yeah, it's still not, it's not everything by any means. Yeah.
Tell me about the note you carry in your wallet. It's on this topic of staying grounded.
Yeah. Oh, that's really lovely. Yeah, well, it's a note. Right now, in fact, because my wallet is like bulging with ridiculous receipts and things. This thing's actually now fixed to my computer monitor, and there's a series of notes on that monitor. Actually, there's a really bunch of, and really interesting kind of but that particular note is from my dad, I guess. Who it's funny you mentioned it. But I haven't sort of thought about that. It's just this beautiful note he sent, and it just he you know, handwritten note, and he wrote once, you know, it just came in the mail out of the blue, and he just said, Trent, you know, so proud, full stop, you've done all the right things. And, you know, love, Dad, you know, like, it brings tears in my eyes just thinking about it, because he's so not, you know, effusive like that. But it was such a beautiful thing, and I just thought, wow, you know. So yeah, I do keep it very close as a sort of a beacon of remembering to try and do all the right things, you know. And like, I don't even know what he quite means by that, but like, it's sort of, you know, try and do all the right thing, go about things the right way, you know. And I thought, wow, that's great. And sort of what he meant by that, I was probably, I don't know, you know. Maybe it was like when my kid was being born, or, you know, and it was just this sort of beautiful thing. It meant the world to me because of the way he said that. It wasn't regarding anything in particular, but it was just about life stuff, you know, and that's huge, you know, to have that. And so, yeah, it's all about remembering the right things.
Well, just to finish up, what do you think has gotten you to this point in your career? Because as I said in the introduction, you are one of the most renowned feature writers in the country, although you still adhere to
Andrew.
the title of writer. What's gotten you here? Like, obviously a lot of hard work and study of the craft itself, but what else can you attribute?
You know, definitely that same stuff, you know, that intrigued me about, you know, the same reason I was reading all those dodgy Johnny Depp pieces. You know, I genuinely have an interest in the human story, like in every human being's story, because maybe I'm trying to sort of process, you know, my own sort of stuff, you know, my own sort of baggage, the many crazy things that are flowing through my mind, you know, and you know, and I'm really interested in who we are as humans, and you know what I mean, probably beyond anything though, is just this idea of story, like the idea of a narrative, you know, that really excites me, and finding a different narrative and a different story in all of these different places. You know, I really love story. Like, so if someone tells me they saw a movie, and the first thing I ask is like, even if I want to see it, I already want them to tell me the end. You know, I want to hear the whole thing. Like, they go, okay, I saw what it's about. Okay, you know, I want them to tell me every narrative point, just because I'm really interested in how that person crafted that story, and I really have a genuine love for it, and I love the fact that in real life there are beautiful stories and tragic stories and really inspiring stories. Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing, you know, as far as, you know, what keeps, well, you know, it's all about the enthusiasm. I think enthusiasm's like probably a really handy thing for anyone to have, and the thing that gives me the enthusiasm is getting to that next story.
Finally, what's on the horizon? Where do you see yourself in 2020, 5 years time?
Wow, 5 years. Hopefully my email remains the same. Writer Trent Dalton for the Weekend Australian magazine, and hopefully I'm a bit more comfortable with the term, you know. And yeah, I'd love to take, you know, just keep. I genuinely just absolutely love my job right now, and but, you know, if anything, just sort of expand and just keep, you know, taking things like, you know, you just see all these wonderful new things like Serial, you know, and all these different great ways to tell stories. You know, some of the ways we've told things on our mag and done them in like these brilliant kind of 3D ways, and just more of that, and just keep taking long form journalism and just telling stories and finding that story, but telling it in a different way and getting to a new place with it, definitely. And you know, if I could be you know, a fairly decent dad in the process, 5 years from now I'll be a very happy human being, Andrew. Yeah, so that's that. You know what? That's probably my biggest priority right now, is getting a bit sort of, you know, yeah, just becoming, yeah, remaining sort of, you know, as kind of, I don't know, trying to just be better at that sort of really important stuff too, you know, like, so yeah, because everything comes at a sort of sacrifice, and remembering, you know, from like the note, do all the right things, you know, that, yeah, and like totally the right thing is to, yeah, just really master that, which is probably the very hard thing to master, fatherhood, but that's definitely huge for me. And 5 years from now, if I had a kid who goes into her teens still digging her dad, man, that would be a very great 2020. Yes.
Thanks, Trent.
Thank you, Andrew. It was really fun, and thank you for indulging me. And sorry if I rambled on too much. And but this is really cool. It's been a really enjoyable chat. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Penmanship, and especially for taking a chance by listening to the very first episode. I hope it lived up to your expectations. My apologies too for the constant thumping noise throughout the interview. That was Trent banging his fist on the desk for emphasis right beside the microphone. I'll try to avoid that in future. Now, as you may have gathered by now, this is my first experience with podcasting, and it's very much a case of learning on the fly, and that includes my radio voice, which I'm still developing. I am recording, editing, and publishing episodes of this podcast between my regular work as a freelance journalist, and while working on my second book throughout 2015, so I can't promise that these episodes will be as regular as I, or you, would like. My current plan is to publish a new episode every few weeks. We'll see how that goes. Quality over quantity, that's the goal. I value and encourage your feedback, however. Given that this show is all about in-depth interviews with Australian writers, editors, publishers, anyone involved in writing culture, I'd love to hear recommendations for who you think I should interview in future episodes. You can email me via andrew@penmanshippodcast.com or find me on Twitter with the username @penmanshipau. If you like what you heard here in the first episode, please share it with anyone in your life who enjoys great Australian writing. And don't forget to subscribe via iTunes or your preferred medium of podcast consumption so that you're notified when the next episode is published. Finally, I'd like to mention that the theme song for Penmanship is called Eternally Yours by a great Australian band named Laughing Clowns, who were active between the years of 1979 and 1984, a few years before I was born. Eternally Yours is used with permission of Laughing Clowns band leader and songwriter Ed Cooper. Many thanks to Ed for allowing me to use one of my favourite songs as my theme music. That's all for now. I'm Andrew McMillen. Thanks for listening and farewell.